What's up, guys? So like I said, I'm going to try and record a few quick videos. The topic that someone picked for me was prehab, and it was supposed to be injury prevention within powerlifting. So I'm going to try and keep it specific to that as a sport. Now, all I mean by prehab is the idea of pre-rehabilitation, the stage before you get injured, making sure that you don't, or at least minimizing the risk. So within powerlifting, the risk is relatively high of getting niggles, but actual injury, less so. General injury, we're not going to be talking about, but it's more the stuff, things like tendonitis, things like strain on the lower back are pretty common, and if you've been powerlifting for any amount of time, you've probably had one of these problems. Now, most of the ways of prehabbing these issues you can incorporate into your training, and it shouldn't be that difficult, and that's only looking at 1 to 2 movements per day added into your training. Now, there's normal stuff that you can and should be doing, and this is stuff like your mobility routines that I don't do, and you definitely should. So there's certain stuff that you should be maintaining, and that's things like a relative range of motion. Now, what I mean by relative is it is applicable to the movements you're doing, but not excessive. So if, for instance, you are a low bar squatter, there's no amount of range of motion that you need to be able to maintain, and anything past that range of motion isn't actually applicable to your sport, and so we don't need to push that boundary. We just need to be able to move well within our range. And this applies to so things like pec stretching for your bench, making sure that you can maintain the range that you use. Again, if you're a high arch bencher, that range changes, and so the requirement is less stressed, and you only have to maintain a suitable range. If you're a sumo deadlifter, that's probably the hardest one in our sport to maintain that range of motion. Maintaining a open hip requires a lot more pressure on the adductors and on the hip flexors. Now, I'm not really going to talk about stretching and so on because I think it's overly done, overrated, and over-explained. It's relatively simple, is that you're just trying to maintain a range of motion, and if you can't move very well in that range, that needs addressing. But what I want to talk about more is the stuff that we don't really talk about. So a lot of people in modern powerlifting are doing a lot higher frequency of a lot of these movements. It used to be old school, benching once a week, squatting once a week, deadlifting once a week, but now most of us bench 2 to 4 times a week, squat twice, maybe 3 times, and deadlift once or twice a week. The biggest issue we see is RSI sort of injuries, repetitive strain injuries. So this is using certain muscle groups too frequently, and this causes low-grade inflammations, things like tendonitis, tendinopathies, and so on. What you actually want to be doing is just making sure that you're creating an even load. So if you're benching at a high frequency, let's say you're benching 4 times a week, that the volume is being controlled over that range. If you're benching once a week and then you've moved on to 4 times a week, you need to split that volume and then build the volume up independently. If we've gone from working, let's say, 5 working sets in one session to 25 working sets over 4 sessions, there's a rapid change, and you're likely to get something like tendonitis because your body can't keep up with the amount of pressure you're putting through it over and over again. So one of the things is just control of volume. Now, that's a simple enough concept, and you should be tracking your volume anyway, but the thing I wanted to talk about as well is making an even split of volume. If your push work has increased, your pull work needs to increase, just to make sure that there is a balance, because this imbalance causes issues. A lot of you benchers will probably find that you get issues around your scapula, your shoulder blade, in the mid portion of your back, upper sort of area, and the likelihood is that just you have an imbalance. The pec's always tight and on tension, and so the upper back is always on a stretch, and that causes an ache. Things like trigger point therapy tend to deal with this, but all we need to do is balance that. So you'll see most of my lifters do something like a face pull a lot of their sessions, or at least upper back work quite frequently. So for this sort of thing, I subscribe face pulls, chest supported row, just as a prehab method. A strong upper back tends to be an advantage across the board. Another thing you can do is if you're a high frequency bencher, especially if you're a low bar squatter, you'll find that you come across bicep issues on occasion. Now, a bicep issue just means that it's giving you an irritation. This can be, let's say, a bicep tendonitis again, or just stress at the glenoid fossa. Not really relevant for you guys to understand that, but effectively it's just stress at one end of the bicep or biceps. So again, to balance that, you can address a few things. If you're a low bar squatter, not keeping it too specific too frequently. You might want to be low bar squatting more often close to competition, but in your off season, experimenting with different grips or different bar positions can take the stress off your bicep and reduce the risk of injury, which is something we want to be looking at. Also, adding in something like an eccentric bicep curl, not with a high frequency, high volume, but high frequency, can reduce cases of tendonitis in a lot of different studies. I will not cite them because I don't have them in front of me, and frankly, I don't care. But that's enough for bench, and that was applying to the squat as well. The other thing for squat is hip flexor injuries. A lot of people complain that their lower back aches. The likelihood is just that you have tight hip flexors, and all I mean by this is, say this is your pelvis, hip flexors this side, lower back this side. If this muscle is tight, it pulls the pelvis into an anterior pelvic tilt, and the lower back then takes more stress. So what we need to do is reduce the stress on the front of the pelvis, and we can move back into a neutral position. This also applies to your deadlift. The hip flexors are some of the most commonly tight and injury-causing muscles, and they're kind of the last thing people look at because the pain is elsewhere, but that is symptomatic pain. So if we're looking at reducing an anterior pelvic tilt, we want to be looking at stretching the pelvis. Now, if you sit all day long, it's stretching the hip flexors. If you sit all day long, the likelihood is they're tight. So I recommend stretching, ideally twice a day, your hip flexors in a couch stretch, which is a lunge position with an elevated back foot, and hold that stretch from anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute. Now, that deals with some of the most common injuries, and like I said, being less specific occasionally just to reduce stress on that repetitive motion, and that goes for all your programming. Over a cycle of training, you want to make sure that you aren't just grinding those lifts into the ground. I think that'll probably do. Now, there's basic movements that aren't just prehab looking. I think a lot of them are overdone, overdressed, and try to make it look more intelligent than they are. But simple stuff like a split squat, like a face pull, like chest supported rows, simple movements that address bilateral movement, as well as anatomical imbalances like the push-pull sort of stuff, is enough to manage most of these issues. It isn't overly complicated, and hopefully that gives you enough. And I'd say the stuff I've given you is probably enough to keep you injury-free for 90% of lifters, and anything more complex needs addressing on an individual basis. Hopefully that helps, and if not, fuck you anyway. Love you all, bye.